Thank you for listening to the Spectrum Lounge. If you enjoy this podcast, please support us at patreon.com/filmfatale_NYC. And be sure to subscribe to the Spectrum Lounge. You can find us on SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, and YouTube.
Oh, God.
What's wrong, Bert?
You're doing that thing.
What thing?
It's right. Stop it.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Are you gonna pick a fight with her? Please don't get all political on me.
No, she's cute. I might learn a thing or two. Hey.
Hey. Hey, Noah.
Birdie, how are
How are you? Mwah.
And you are a bartender.
I can be.
Yeah?
What are you drinking?
I take whiskey.
All right. So you're back from Israel?
Yeah, my brother married a French guy, and then Valerie just said I could come, stay here for the rest of the summer. Yeah, just work on some paintings.
Okay.
I promised myself I won't get too drunk tonight like last year, though.
Oh, yeah.
Last summer at one of Valerie's party, I got a little too crazy, and Birdie here saved my life.
She's good at that.
Hi, welcome everybody. This is Rebecca Theodore-Vachon, and you are watching a special edition of the Spectrum Lounge. Today we will be reviewing the movie My Belle, My Beauty, written and directed by Marion Hill, and I am joined by a good friend of mine, Craig. Hi, Craig.
Hey, Rebecca, how are you?
I'm good. I've been looking forward to this. One of the great things about having a podcast is I can invite whoever I want.
Well, one of the cool things about having friends like you is that they have podcasts, and I get to be a guest.
I know, right?
No, actually, what's really cool is when you have friends that you have conversations with all the time, like texting, this, that, the other.
Yeah.
And then now you get to bring these conversations that you and I have anyway to like a group of other folks.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, with My Belle, I think you had sent me an interview. I think you had sent me an article about it like in April or May. So you were like, this is something that should be on your radar. It's centering a Black poly queer woman. And I was like, yes, definitely want that. So so I was lucky enough to reach out to the studio. They sent me a online screener. We both watched it because I wanted to get your views on it too, because you have some very strong and definite opinions about non-monogamy and polyamory in the Black community. So I guess we'll start out again. My Belle, My Beauty is going to be released this Friday, limited release, I believe. So just check your local listings to see where it's going to be shown. And basically the movie is about, centers again, a Black poly queer woman named Birdie. She's a jazz singer, I believe, from New Orleans. She's living in the south of France, living it up with her jazz musician husband. And things get complicated when her husband invites her ex-lover. Clearly, the three of them were in some sort of triad. I'll say a V. They were in a V. Yeah, they were a throuple. And so the husband, I guess Birdie is going through some sort of existential crisis, like she's having a creative block, emotional block. So he comes up with the brilliant idea, hey, let me invite your ex-girlfriend who broke your heart to try to, motivate you to get back in the game. Because as we'll speak, each of them have their own motivations when it comes to Birdie. But I just wanted to start off by getting your initial thoughts and opinions about the movie. What did you think about My Belle?
Yeah. Listen, first and foremost, I enjoyed the film. I thought it was really well done. And more so than enjoying the film, I appreciate the film. I appreciate that Marion Hill is telling a story that needs to be told. And there are many stories that need to be told on the big screen and the mainstream. And it's very rare that we get a chance to see various ways in which people can love and connect with one or more people. And I thought the movie did a really good job artistically. The storyline, the plot, the characters, the acting, all of that was enjoyable in terms of the senses. I mean, it was beautiful to watch. And you felt good. You felt sadness. You felt all of the emotions that you would want to, and kind of a romantic story really is what this is. But I also just appreciate its importance in terms of the overall canon of movies and the stories we tell about how you can love and how you can receive love. And so, one, I just think they took some really important steps, and we need to have more of them in terms of telling some of these stories. And then one of the things I'll just say, just off the top, the story, although it is about an open relationship, at least we understand that it was an open relationship. That there was a poly relationship at some point. When we start the movie, it is not a poly open relationship. Fred and Bertie are married, and what we best know is a closed monogamous relationship, and so it becomes over time that we understand that it was once open and maybe they're opening up again. But I don't think the intention of the movie is to advocate for polyamory or open relationships. And in fact, I don't remember, Rebecca, them using the word poly or anything in the movie, right? So
no, they don't. Yeah.
So in that way, I would say it's also really important that the film is told in a way that's not about advocacy. It's not about let us teach people about polyamory or different types of relationships. It's like, let me tell you about a story of human beings who love each other and they're dealing with their own shit and dealing with each other and trying to figure out how to navigate that in a way in which, and Marion talks about this in an article that you and I read, her goal in this movie, she says she just wants everyone to find a piece of themselves in it. And so in that way, mission accomplished. I think this film wonderfully provides an opportunity for everyone, regardless of where you are, what you believe, what your experiences are or have been, to kind of see yourself in some way in this film.
But you're hitting up on certain points because to me, I feel like, with a lot of the talk about Oscars So White and inclusivity and representation matters, right? And so we're fighting for more representation of Black people and Latino people and Asian Americans and Minas and Native Americans. So we're starting to see some movement, some more than others, right? Like Shang-Chi is coming out next month, finally, first Asian superhero from the MCU, all of that. And so in the conversation, I do feel that, at least for me, I feel like polyamory and non-monogamy is like going to be like the final frontier. Like all that representation, especially of queer people, is important. I do feel that we still live in a very heteronormative and it's very monogamous, right? I feel like with a lot of romantic dramas and comedies, the script is you're supposed to find your Prince Charming. There is that one person, your soulmate, right, that will complete you. And once you find him, he's gonna look like Idris Elba or Aldis Hodge, or you know what I mean, particularly for Black women. Like, and I think for the purposes of this one, we'll talk specifically about Black poly, right, and the representation of Black romance.
For sure.
Yeah, I think as a people, we are very invested in the images of Black love. And there's a specific reason for that, because for the first 400 to 500 years, we were robbed of that, right? We came here, we were brought here as slaves against our will, right? Our sexual agency, our freedom was taken, our sexual agency was 100%. Taken. Yeah, you'd have slave masters that would be like, well, this guy is 6'3" and she's 5'9" and she's got big hips. And so, yeah, you know what I mean? So
sexuality was a breeding process for us. Yeah. And yeah, you're right. Yeah. And that, not only that, and then even post slavery, where you were treated as cattle and effectively bred as cattle, then you were fetishized and your sex, and then we were, and so we were, our sexuality was demonized. And so we've never really had agency over our own stories, our own narratives. The narratives have always been created for us. And so I do think we're going to always be very sensitive about these stories being told in a way in which we feel are authentic and true. But I think it's also, just going back to this film, if there's anyone, if you're Black and brown going to watch this film, hoping that it's going to speak to the layers and the complexities and the nuances and the needs and the diversity of love and the way we love in our community, whether it's like explicit and it's known and is part of kind of the African-American Black myth or not, you're not going to find that here. This film does not even begin to wrestle and deal with that, but it does touch on race gender, sexual orientation, class. And I do think Birdie's character as a, African American Southern sister, like I watched her. I loved her, by the way. I'm like, I love this woman,
Yes.
Birdie. Hey, I'm here, but her character is a woman. We know her. Birdie. Birdie's
Yes.
your sister. She's your cousin. She's your soror. She's like, this. So she's someone you've dated. So in some ways, although the film does not really even begin to address the need for us in our own communities to see what healthy non-monogamous relationships can look like, it does start, I think, the conversation. All right.
Okay.
And I think Birdie's a good person to start it, but you're absolutely right. There's still a lot that needs to be done before we can really say we're having that conversation.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I liked Ma Belle. Let me say what I liked about the movie and the things that I kind of struggled with.
Okay.
Number one, I am always here for seeing Black women joy, and I think particularly now in light of this pandemic and political upheaval, to just see this Black woman living freely, right, and living life on her terms, I think that's really important. And just the depictions of Black women in traveling internationally, being in Paris or France, wherever it is very rare.
Right.
So I like, for the wanderlust in me, that it was hitting all the spots. I was like, yes,
Yep.
the cinematography was beautiful,
Yep.
gorgeous. And these kind of roles don't usually come to Black actresses, not these type of nuanced, complicated, messy, you know what I mean? Like, usually we have
Sure.
to be like the Claire Huxtables, you know what I
That's
mean?
right.
And we're like the magical negresses who know everything, you know what I mean?
Right.
And we
That's
don't
right.
really engage in our sexual agency. We're taking care of other people and not of ourselves. So I do love the idea of the representation of having this Black queer poly woman. So that I was like, yes, okay, I can definitely see myself in Birdie in those areas. And the actress Adela Johnson, I'm in love with her. I have a
Mhm.
crush on her. I'm trying to get her on my podcast. We're working on that. But I agree with you. Like, she brought this authenticity, because I think the actress is actually from New Orleans, and just to see like her brown skin and her kinky fro
Yeah.
and the accent and her frying
Mhm.
fish, and you know what I mean? Like, it
Mhm.
felt
Yes.
like home,
It was
but
authentic.
it was authentic. But on the other hand, these were some of the things that I was struggling with. It was sort of like the drop of chocolate and milk. Like
Yeah.
she was literally the only Black person in this movie throughout the. I was texting you while I was watching. I was like, "There's gonna be
Yeah.
some Black people, right?" And you were like, "Don't." No
No.
spoilers. There's no other
Spoiler
Black
alert.
people.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was like, wow, no other
Yeah.
Black people except this woman. Which, okay, that's fine, but I wish that they had addressed that in the movie, because I'm just imagining being a Black woman. And this movie was shot before the pandemic. So let's say this movie takes place, I don't know, 2018, 2019. You're telling me that this Black woman leaves New Orleans, right? And I'm not saying she owes anything to anybody, but I mean, Black Lives Matter started in like what, 2013, 2014, 2018, 2019. We were just coming off of Philando Castile and all of these other things. And I was just sort of like, if I'm this Black woman that's surrounded by all this whiteness, I'm gonna have some questions, or a certain feeling, or a certain conversation, right? And because the other thing too is that both of her partners, her husband and her ex-lover, the woman, her lesbian lover, are white, and there's not one conversation about race in this movie, not one. I'm not saying they needed a deep, heavy conversation about that, but at least a mention of like, hey, babe, I'm like the only Black woman here. I'm the only Black person here. Like, yes, you have a Black woman that is the lead of this movie, but I just felt like if Birdie, at least if I relate to Birdie, and if we're similar in certain ways, I feel like I would be having conversations with my white partners about like, why would
Yeah.
you take me all the way from Black ass New Orleans and put me in the middle of this
Yeah.
very white plays. I don't know.
Yeah,
What are
sure.
your thoughts?
Listen, there's a part of me that just wants to imagine that there was, for the sake of editing, that they cut out a piece of the story when they were in New Orleans, a very black city with a very rich black history, and you get the sense that that's the world that she comes from.
Right.
At the very beginning, as they're, kind of working through a song, tell me you love me, and she's like, I don't like this song.
Hmm.
This is not my voice, right? Like,
Right.
and you almost feel like in some ways there is an implicit conversation about race. It's not explicit. The implicit conversation is she's away from her community,
Hmm.
and she now is in this very isolated place, and people see her not for who she is, because there's this point where she's like, you guys think you can just give me pills and that's going to make my depression go away, I'm going to be able to sleep. You actually have not taken the time to get to know me, like who I really am. And
Right.
so in many ways, as we think about the way black people were, welcomed as artists and performers in France in the early 1900s, this was a place where black people were, in many cases, welcomed not because they were appreciated as humans, but they were appreciated as great performers. And so there are
Hmm.
scenes where Birdie's walking through the town, and people walk up to her and like, oh, Birdie, ça va bien, oh,
Hmm.
and they're
Yeah.
having these conversations with her. And there's one point where this elderly lady says that, the music that your husband was playing made me think of Django or something like that. And there's this moment. Yeah, interesting. There are moments where you kind of get the sense that even although she's not performing, because it becomes clear she hasn't sang for 6 months,
Hmm.
that she's still being kind of fetishized in town as this kind of muse and this kind of unique, kind of
Hmm.
person who's kind of picking fruit in the market, and like and hoping that she'll come back and perform and be amusement for us.
Hmm.
First and foremost, I don't doubt that her, character husband Fred loves her. Let's just assume that there really is authentic, genuine love. But it's clear that he's
Hmm.
invited her ex girlfriend here in some ways because he's trying to get her out of her funk so that they can go on tour. Like, I need you to perform. I need you to
Mm.
I
Yep.
need you to be this thing that I fell in love with, who's going to sing with me, and we're going to be the cool happening, kind of, chocolate.
Interracial jazz couple.
And so there's this kind of like, I need you to be this thing for me, right? And then we understand that her relationship with Lane, there's images and pictures and reflections of moments when they were happy, but you do kind of get some sense that there was, that relationship also was somewhat abusive, right? She was
Hmm.
using Birdie in a way, and not, kind of investing in that relationship. She left, without
Hmm.
explaining. She left. She didn't come to her mom's funeral. She didn't come to the wedding. She didn't
Hmm.
show up like she really cared about this person,
Right.
in a deep, meaningful way. Meanwhile,
Hmm.
Birdie is like showing all this love and care. She's attending to Lane while she's there visiting. She's making sandwiches and like being the perfect hostess for a husband when they're having their jam sessions.
Hmm.
But meanwhile, depressed because we think she's lonely. She's mourning the loss of her mom. She's feeling alone in this otherwise world that's not her own.
Right.
She doesn't even speak French well, as we kind of understand. So this is really not her world.
Hmm.
And and although many of the depictions of Polly that are not healthy, where there's just this guy's got all these women and this, that, and the other, and I think it was great to see a V relationship where she was the hen, she was the, it really wasn't a polycule. Fred did not have a relationship with Lane, so we were able to understand and appreciate those relationships very uniquely, where
Hmm.
she really was the center, and I think that was great and that was positive to be able to see that.
Yes.
But unfortunately, she was in two unhealthy relationships.
Yes.
Anybody, when you see this film, you're going to love Birdie. You're going to love her character, and then you're going to find yourself, particularly if you're, a black person, you're going to say, like, I'm trying to understand, what is it that she sees in these people? What is she getting out of this? What are they giving to her? And do I think it is do I think this wonderful gem is worthy of these? Or are they worthy of this gem? And you kind of find yourself in that kind of mind frame of just thinking through the dynamics of that relationship. But
Hmm.
but the thing that probably annoyed me most was, I kind of felt throughout the film that this is a person whose fundamental needs were not being met in either relationship, and she was being used, and
Yes.
to some degree. And then ultimately, the way all of them are troubled in some ways. I mean, Lane is, she's you and I talked about this. She is a she's a lesbian woman who obviously has, dealing with trouble in her own life, inability to be stable. She's kind of moving from relationship to relationship. She's still trying to find herself. We don't know how old they are in this movie. They're probably in their 30s. It looks like maybe late 20s, 30s, kind of given where they are in her life cycle. And she's still trying to figure out what she wants to do, and kind of moving from host to host, right?
Ooh, yep.
There was this kind of conversation that she and Birdie have about her ex. Like, I told you she was crazy. Why'd you stay with her? But she was a host for a moment. Birdie was a host. And then you kind of have this sense like that in the movie, she kind of, in an effort to make Birdie jealous, starts to really show love and affection and start spending time with this Israeli woman. And even that feels like she's moved on to another host. And I think her name is Noah, is so excited about her, but she has no idea that her mind is really someplace else. Her mind is not even on her. And so unfortunately, we now have seen the spin cycle. Birdie was a part of that spin cycle before. And Lane, this very troubled person, is really now moved on to another victim. And that's really sad. The only saving grace is that at the very end of the movie, it looks like Birdie may have found her voice.
Yes.
She's singing again.
Yeah.
And, and even though she's acknowledged that Lane is going to move on, she says, I'm going to go tour. I'm going to go sing. I'm going to find my voice. And that gives me hope that her character, despite being in this really interesting V relationship, if you want to call it that, has found some peace. Yeah. And maybe is moving on.
Yeah. I agree with everything that you're saying, because going back to something that you said earlier about depictions of poly and non-monogamy, that TV shows and movies don't necessarily have to be polyamory 101, right? Like, they don't necessarily have to be. And I think that's the one thing that I liked about Ma Belle, is that it was already established. Like, this was the relationship that they had, and like they didn't even really use the word poly or triad or V. They didn't use any of that. I think there's a conversation between Lane when she first meets Noah, the Israeli soldier, and Noah is asking her. She was like, well, like, what is the situation with you three? And then Lane breaks it down. She was like, well, I was in a relationship with Birdie, but not Fred, right? So that's the V, right? Like, Birdie is sort of like the apex or whatever. And so I like that it wasn't like, it's not like a sort of like, oh, this is how we became poly or whatever. It's already been established. It's in the past and whatever. So I like that. And I think that's like the queer part of the movie I could relate to. The poly part of it wasn't quite clicking for me. And you said this earlier, I'm going to cop to it. The relationship between Birdie and Lane, I just didn't get it. Like, I was just like, I don't even understand why this woman was with. Like, Lane is terrible. She is a terrible person. She is the most Karen of lesbians. She just came in with this entitlement and selfishness, which is probably why Birdie broke up with her. And but to me, it's like, whenever you watch movies about triangles, right, or three people, I feel like the best depictions of triangles is when both partners, right, or potential love interests are equally compelling, right? Like, I should be watching and I should be torn. Should she be with Lane or should she be with Fred, or like, you know what I mean? But from the get-go, I just didn't like Lane. I was like, get rid of her.
and to be honest, people who understand this stuff understand that it also wasn't ethical. Because one, Birdie did not consent to Fred inviting this woman into her house with the expectation that there was going to be intimacy and relationship. He'd already planned, like, well, she's going to live here.
He picked her out. He picked out his own wife.
So people would understand that, one, there was some consent issues there. There was also, so when you think about ethical non-monogamy versus unethical non-monogamy, like, people understand what non-ethical non-monogamy is, because that's
can you break down to us what ethical non-monogamy means? What does that mean?
Yeah, it's a great question, because these terms are used so loosely, and very few people even people who think they know what the terms mean
Hmm.
oftentimes don't. And for sure, lots of people reference them, have cartoon bubbles that pop over their head, and they imagine what these terms mean, but they really don't. And when you kind of demystify it, you realize like, oh, that's actually something I kind of get, or I already kind of instinctively knew what it was. And by the way, I'm not an expert. There are people like Esther Perel and there are books like Ethical Sluts, and there are lots of like more scientific, more, kind of academic ways of describing it. But for me,
Yes.
Rebecca, let's zoom out a little bit, right? And let's think about kind of the relationship taxonomy, starting from a place that most people can understand.
Mm-hmm.
So, and if you think about an umbrella, you
Mm-hmm.
have monogamous relationships and non-monogamous relationships. All
Okay.
right. We understand what monogamy looks like. We know what that is. We don't need to get into whether it's good or bad or right or wrong, progressive. We just understand what that is. Then there's non-monogamy, and within non-monogamy, I think you have ethical non-monogamy and
Mm-hmm.
unethical non-monogamy. So let's
Okay.
just be super clear. Most people who are not married in monogamous relationships or not in exclusive relationships with a single person, meaning they're dating, and I'm seeing guys and I'm seeing girls or whatever. You're just out here living your best life. You're probably seeing multiple people. You're going on multiple dates. Maybe there's some people in your life that you kind of like, but maybe they're not. You don't like them enough to take them home to mama, daddy, or whatever. But there are a lot of people who actually don't think of themselves as non-monogamous, but they really are, right? In
Yes.
practice. In
Exactly.
practice.
Mm-hmm.
But most people are not ethically monogamous because they're not being honest, meaning, hey, I'm dating 3 or 5 people, but the 3 or 5 people don't know that they are one of 3 or 5 people. Or you're dating someone and you really have no intention of marrying them or taking it to the next level, escalating it, and you're never clear about what your intentions are. And so in many ways, there's a lot of relationships that are unethical. Or they're people who are married and they cheat, or they're in relationships and they cheat. That is unethical, meaning no one is consenting in that relationship. What we're talking about, Rebecca, is ethical non-monogamy. Ethical non-monogamy means that there are 2 or more consenting adults who agree on the form of relationship that they're going to have with each other. There's a social contract that they have with each other around what they will give to each other, what they expect from each other, what are in the rules, what are outside the rules, what are in the boundaries. And there's a wide range of relationships, from casual and transactional to long lasted, intimate, integrated finances, family, all of that. And so really there's a big spectrum. And when we talk about polyamory, as for example, that word poly and more, multiple loves, meaning that I have more than one loving relationship. Doesn't necessarily mean marriage,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't necessarily mean that this is someone you're going to be with for the rest of your life, but you have more than one loving relationship with another human being.
Right.
Um, and all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which is like, hey, maybe you have a relationship with one person, but you guys have an understanding and agreement that you could still date and see other people, or have casual experiences, or have other kind of types of relationships outside of your kind of core primary relationship. So that whole spectrum and everything in between is what I think of is ethical non-monogamy, meaning I have had a conversation, I am transparent, I have consent, and it's mutual in terms of the relationships I'm going to have in my life, and vice versa. And then obviously there's a whole kind of series of relationships within poly. There's solo poly, there's kitchen table poly, there's closed poly, there's polycues. And for the sake of this conversation, I don't think it's necessarily helpful to go into all of the different permutations that people could at one point or another desire and find themselves in, because at the end of the day, it's at whatever group of people decide they want to have. Maybe kitchen table, which means all of my partners can sit down at a table. We're all friends. They know each other. Doesn't necessarily mean they have a relationship with each other, but it's lots of transparency.
Mm.
Closed, hey, it's just us, and we don't allow anyone else into our relationship. It's just us. And so the whole idea, just going way back up to the top, is that you have monogamy, you have non-monogamy. There are a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people who already are non-monogamous just by virtue of not being married and dating.
Right.
The question is whether or not you're ethical about it. Are
Mm.
you communicating? Are you intentional? Are you transparent? Do you have agreement and consent from the other people who are involved in your relationship? And that really is the ecosystem that we're talking about. And that is the ecosystem we're talking about in this movie.
Yeah, but so let's talk about like the unethical things that went on in this relationship, because like we said, this movie is not really about a poly 101 movie, right? They're not sitting you down and be like, this is, but here, we're your guys. We'll tell you in this movie what's right and what is good and what isn't good
Right.
about that, right? So let's start with Fred inviting Lane over. To the outside person, they might be like, well, I don't see the problem. I mean, they were lovers, right? And clearly Lane still has feelings for her and Birdie has feelings, for Lane. Well, so what was unethical about that? What mistake did Fred make in doing that? Why was it unethical?
Well, this is unethical in the broadest of sense. This is his life partner. He's married to this woman. He's married to Birdie, and he's keeping a big secret from her, which is I am manipulating and sneaking behind her back to reintroduce someone who actually really hurt her. Lane hurt Birdie. There's trauma there, right?
Yes.
There's trauma,
Yeah.
and Fred kind of has an I alone can fix it type of like, I'm just gonna, kind of like without consenting, without kind of consulting with you, without talking through, without understanding where you are. I'm just gonna do this, and I'm gonna do this in a way that isn't transparent. I didn't get consent. And it's not so much just like, hey, stop by for dinner on your way to the train station, to go to Spain. It's like, and maybe you'll come live with us, right? So he's making some big assumptions that not only impact him but impact someone else.
Yes.
And that is wrong, and for reasons I think most people would understand. And even after his wife Birdie kind of confronts him, like so the first wrong would be I did said thing, which is invite her, and now I realize that was wrong, and you're angry. He continues to push it, right? He doesn't
Right.
You don't have a check-in. Let's check in and see what's the right thing to do. He's kind of like, give it time. You'll like this, so which is a big problem with the ways in which people think about poly traditionally, kind of the stereotypes with the man at the V or the hinge or whatever. And the interest between the two women is really for his gaze and for his amusement and for his enjoyment. Like, let's see the women get together. Don't worry, you'll like it. Like this whole idea, like, don't worry, you'll like it, and there's something about he's assuming that Birdie's going to enjoy Lane. He's going to love her. He's going to want to be with her, and making assumptions about what your partner wants or needs without talking to them, without doing check-ins. That continue to really make that problematic as a relationship. And then I think kind of the ongoing part, which was unethical, was that we began to understand through this conversation between Lane and Fred that he really wants that relationship rekindled so that Birdie will be in a good headspace, emotional space to go tour with him. So there's another kind of double cut there, which is like, I would love to say I'm doing this because I think you're grieving and I think this is going to be healthy and good for you. But the reality is I'm doing this because I want to advance my career.
Right.
I've got these, my manager, and I've got the band, and I've got these tour stops that are all expecting you to show up. And I don't think you're going to show up and sing with me unless I can kind of fix you. Right.
Right.
And so the entire way in which he goes about, kind of addressing his wife's alleged needs, his assumed needs that she might have, I think are really problematic on a whole lot of levels.
Right. You know what? It just us having this conversation, like especially that part of Fred trying to fix her, right? And it's like you said earlier, it's this idea of he needs Birdie to produce, right? To start singing because that gives them money or whatever. And what that makes me think about, and this is why I say, like, when with the colorblind casting, that when you cast a Black woman in a role, you've got to think holistically of like how the optics are going to look and certain relationship dynamics, how that looks when the person is a Black woman and your partner is white. You can't have this, oh, it's just relationships, it's just humanity, and that's just, and no, it's not, because I'm thinking about two instances, right? We're thinking about Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles, right? Two
Mhm.
Black women athletes that, let's start with Naomi Osaka. She was supposed to, finish, what was it, the French Open? I forget which one it was.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah,
Yeah.
they should pull it
And
out of. Yeah,
right. And so she came out and she was like, I will not be doing any press conferences. I'm going to play, right? I'm an athlete. That's what I'm here to do. But these post game interviews, I'm not doing it anymore. So she was
right.
like, I'm fine. And the backlash that she got from that was just, it was the misogyny. It was misogynoir, but because she's Black and a woman, it was like, well, how dare you? You're so entitled. You're so spoiled. How? I mean, the woman was already there to play the sport. She's just saying, I don't want to speak to these reporters because I've seen some of these press conferences. A lot of these reporters are horrible. They're racist and they're sexist, right? So she's protecting her mental health, and she was like, I don't want to do that. And then it became so bad that she just dropped out, and then that caused a whole other firestorm. Like, oh, how dare you, right? So it's
Right.
this whole idea of women having to produce, right? And to
Hmm.
prove their worthiness to have a space in this world, right? And then a
Right.
couple of months later, now we see Simone Biles, where she's like, and we know the reason why is because I think the medication that she needed, the Olympics were like, no, you can't bring that into Japan. So without the medication, she was just like, I can't perform. I can't produce. And so she was like, I'm not going to. And then we saw the same exact fact. How dare you, Black women? How dare you, Black women, say that you don't want to perform for us, right? And this is
Right.
and that goes to the history of Blacks in sports, not just women, but men too. But
That's right.
that's what I was thinking about when I was watching My Belle, is this manipulation of this Black woman where Fred wanted her to produce in a creative way, right? Where it's like, I need you to sing so we can go on tour. And then Lane, on the other hand, is wanting her to produce in a like the emotional labor. I want you to
Hmm.
love me. I want you to love me. I want you to pay attention to me. I want you.
That's
And
right.
clearly, this woman does not have the emotional bandwidth for any of their nonsense. But they didn't care. You know
And,
what I mean?
and not only that, Rebecca was so foul. Is that Fred tells Lane to bring back these sleeping pills.
Mm-hmm.
Just bring these pills.
Right.
Like like if you can't fix her by just loving on her, then I
Mm-hmm.
will get her drugged up. The kind of this throwback to Lady Sings the Blues and Billie Holiday, and like the way
Yes.
that you
Mm-hmm.
know Black musicians, particularly of that era, were medicated, and many of them got addicted to drugs just by virtue of kind of the stresses of their performance and the culture they were in. But
Mm-hmm.
anyway, that was something really shady where he was just like, we're gonna give her some drugs. But the other thing too, at the end of the movie, there's this kind of scene where Lane tells Birdie,
Mm-hmm.
and gets into unilateral contract versus bilateral contracts, multilateral contracts, because there's some there where she
Mm-hmm.
says, I need all of you.
Mm-hmm.
Like at this
Mm-hmm.
point, they started to rekindle their relationship, and Birdie is starting to kind of, the ice is thawing. She started to feel vulnerable again, and starting to say, maybe I could have a relationship. Let's see where it's going to go. And
Mm-hmm.
then Lane kind of springs this on her and says, yes, we can do this, but
Mm-hmm.
only on my terms, which is I have to have all of you, which could mean leave your husband. It could mean like,
Yes.
it's not really clear what she means by that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but it's clear that Birdie realizes in that moment that she can't give more than whatever she's giving at that moment. And so this kind of ultimatum,
Mm-hmm.
unilateral contract, which is like, on my terms, you either accept it or you don't.
Right.
That is also not ethical, right? Because if someone is forced into a situation, or they don't have the ability to negotiate those terms, that's not ethical, and so that's a problem. And the fact that Lane kind of rides off into the sunset with Noah kind of reminds us that she felt really entitled, like it's my way or no way. And
I told you she was a Karen. She was a lesbian
yeah.
Karen. You know what I mean? And I think that's important because it's like, it's this idea that, you know, and I'm going to be clear here, that the way that white women can be harmful to Black women, and women of color, and particularly in this context, they were in an intimate relationship. White women can still enact emotional violence on Black
Mhm.
women and women of color, even if that is their partner, their romantic partner. And it was just so infuriating to me how, like, from what we understand, Lane just disappeared. They were in this relationship. The three of them were, it sort of like in
Mhm.
this throuple, and then Lane just bounced and just disappeared. And like, I can't even imagine what it's like for somebody that I was in an intimate relationship with. Like, my mother's sick and dying, and you don't even give me a phone call, not a text, not anything to be like, hey, how's your mom or and to not even show up at the funeral, even if you're not talking to me, even if we're no longer romantic partners. What Lane was showing was a conditional type of love, which is very toxic, right? Whereas, like, even if even if you and Birdie had not been speaking for a year, you still show up for the people that you care about. And clearly she did not do that.
Right.
And yeah, and for Fred to bring this woman back into Birdie's life, that's another form of violence. Like you said, like, she hurt Birdie in a really awful way. And Fred saw that. It wasn't like they were in a relationship when Lane left. So Fred witnessed all of that. And
That's
for you to
right.
think that that was a good idea to bring the person that emotionally harmed me to, they were both awful.
Well,
I was watching the whole
there's actually something else, Rebecca, that
thing. Mhm,
as you were talking, it reminded me of this really subversive kind of competition between, you really healthy metamor relationships are supportive and understanding of each other.
mhm,
Maybe in a V relationship, there's a schedule. Hey, I see partner one on Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and partner two on Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, and
mhm,
Sundays I have to myself, whatever. But there's this kind of understanding, and maybe in healthy relationships, if someone their schedule is off and I need to swap a day, or we accommodate this change, like healthy metamor relationships are like, oh, absolutely, I understand. I want you guys to be happy. It's compersion. I
mhm,
really get happy knowing that the person I love is being loved and experiencing love from someone else, which is
mhm.
there's a line in the movie where they talk about that, and I thought that was really appreciative, was really
Yeah.
cool when Lane says, how could you not love the person who loves the person you love.
Right.
But we learned that there's some tension there, right? Because
Mhm,
when Lane leaves the relationship, kind of unexpectedly, and Birdie says, "You never came to check in, and you didn't come to my mom's funeral." She says, "But Fred forbid me. He did not allow me to reach out." So she, yeah. So assuming that was true,
okay.
um, that would be foul, right? If you're
Very.
now, if your partner is like, you can't see her anymore, like, don't reach out to her. And it could be
Mhm,
like, we don't know, it could be because she's still grieving and she's hurt, and the presence of you would like hurt her more. So we don't know if that was like because he was trying to keep her for himself,
mhm,
or if that was in some ways, because he was trying to protect her. We don't know.
mhm,
But what we do know is at the end of the movie, when she says, "I need all of you," meaning I can't share you with someone else, that is not a healthy kind of metamor relationship. So again, in this movie, they're not trying to like model like what is quote unquote good. They're just
mhm.
modeling humans as flawed creatures as they are in the
Yes.
way they show up in all these different type of relationships. Lane is very selfish. She's very self-centered,
Mhm,
and she brings that. And unfortunately, Birdie is a very loving character. Is very giving, and
mhm.
she's with two emotional vampires who really are sucking her dry. Um,
Not emotional
that's a great
vampire.
book, by the way. Emotional Vampires. Check out that book. You probably have a
Oh
few in
wait,
your life.
that's actually a book.
It is a book. Yeah.
Oh my god, I have to read it. I have to read it. Yeah, but I think because you and I, when we talked about the movie afterwards, and you said that where you were like, one of the things that you liked about the movie is that you could see yourself in each of those characters. You were, at one point you were Birdie, at one point you were Fred, and at one point you were Lane. And now that I'm thinking about it, I was like, well, usually things that we hate, or that usually things that we hate, it's because we see it reflected in ourselves. And
That's
so,
right.
like, I'm
Yeah.
thinking of, like, I'm like, okay, I can definitely relate to Birdie. Have I been Fred at some point in my relationships? Definitely. It's harder to say that I've been
You've probably
Lane.
been lame too. Don't. You've probably been lame too. Right.
I think so. I think definitely. But I think this is why cinema is so important. That's why art is so important. Because if
Right.
you have perfect characters, you're not learning anything from that. It's like having flawed and nuanced characters is a really great mirror for yourself to kind of work
Which
these things out.
which
Yeah.
is why I love listening to your podcast when you're
Oh,
talking
thank
about
you.
Marvel characters, and we
Yeah,
talk
yeah.
about Marvel characters versus DC characters. The reason why I
Yes.
love Marvel characters is because
Uh-huh.
they're all flawed. Peter
Uh-huh.
Parker can't get the girls in high school. Wolverine is like trying to wrestle with being an animal. I mean, like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and
Yeah.
you can, like, Captain America is like the only character that's like, I don't know if I really know a lot of people like that, but
Right.
everybody else, I kind of know someone like that,
Right, right, right,
whereas,
right.
like, the super friends, I mean, like, the DC characters are a little bit harder to relate to. But you're right, like, great
Uh-huh.
movies,
Mm-hmm.
they tell stories of real people,
Yes.
and they tell stories of people that you can relate to, and
Mm-hmm.
and oftentimes if they really do it right, and
Mm-hmm.
and they can disarm you in a way in the movie where you don't even realize it, they're showing you yourself.
Right.
uh, and you have to, like, so I, after that movie, to be honest with you, I had to
Mm.
check out some pieces of Lane in me and just be like, wow,
Woo!
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't
Yeah.
like, that there's a little bit of selfishness in there that,
Mm-hmm.
that you don't feel like it's selfish. I mean, I'm sure she didn't think she was showing up as a selfish person,
Of course
but the
not.
way, no, of course not.
Yeah, yeah, of
That's what
course.
entitlement is all about.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but I think that was one of the cool things about the movie, is that you really can see, hopefully, some
Mm-hmm.
parts of you in all of them.
Yeah, I think so too. But I
I
think
love them.
that is an important tenet in polyamory and non-monogamy, is the fact that um if you're investing your happiness and based on the status of your relationship or the status of how many people you're seeing or not seeing, you're gonna have some hard times. Like, that's something that I'm still wrestling with. Like, me being with someone or not being, it doesn't determine my worth as a person. But we live in a society that tells us that all the time. You turn on the
Right.
television, you go to the movies, and they tell you, and particularly if you're a woman of a certain age and you're not married and you don't have a man, you're just, you know what I mean? And God forbid if you're over 50 and you're past childbearing age. So you're not fertile, you're not young, you're basically of no use. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so that's
Yeah.
why this pressure for women, oh, I gotta get married before I'm 40. I gotta have some kids. And I'm not saying that women don't want to have children. Of course, there are women who have a natural need to be mothers. But I'm wondering how many of us, when we sit down and really think about it, our romantic motivations, our need to get married, like how much of that is really us, right? Particularly if we're looking for a monogamous relationship, how much of that is really our personal desire versus what the world and our culture is telling us that we should do that.
That's
And
right.
yeah, and so, but I think this is why we need more movies about polyamory and non-monogamy, because I just want, like, particularly as a Black woman, I just want us to have more options. I don't want Black women to feel that you have to get married and that you have to have children. That, you know what I mean? Like, one of my favorite people is Tracy Ellis Ross. Tracy Ellis Ross is like, what, 48, 49? She is living her best life, okay? She is
Hmm.
unmarried. She is doing it. I mean, yes, she has privilege and she has money. She's an actress. That's true. But I love the fact that she's never bemoaning the fact that she's single. Like, her IG is just like, oh, I went to Monaco one week. Oh, I went here. Or I did this. And
Right.
I'm just like, yeah, I like that. And unfortunately, we don't even have movies that depict characters like Tracy, right? Like, her most
Right.
famous role, ironically, was playing Joan Clayton on Girlfriends. And Joan was like this neurotic woman who was obsessed with marriage. She had like a 3-month rule, like, I don't have sex before 3 months. Like, she was just very controlling. And it was like, and Tracy is the total opposite of that. And I wish that we had more depictions of women like Tracy. Like, you can be unmarried and happy. Like, and especially,
It's
yeah.
well, it's funny. The most recent Time magazine cover shows the cast of Star Trek from the 60s or 70s or whatever, and it was interesting
Mm-hmm.
how I was at CVS and I was about to check out, and I looked down and I saw this magazine cover, and on it, you've got Captain Kirk standing in the center, square chin, perfect, like ding, like the classic, perfect guy. But it was interesting while they were kind of modeling that. The Star Trek Enterprise leadership team was a Black woman, an Asian man, who I think, an alien, Dr. Spock.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting how there was a time when movies sometimes would tell us stories about a world that we don't live in,
Mm-hmm.
tell stories about things that are surely possible, but we haven't yet come to realize that, including different relationship types, different ways. And, I mean, we've never seen a black superhero like, Black
Mm-hmm.
Panther until we saw him on the black screen.
Mm-hmm.
But ironically, that comic book came out in the 60s, as you probably know. And so we've been
Right.
telling stories about the future. What I think is interesting about now, post COVID,
Mm-hmm.
is that people are not waiting for films. They're not waiting for media. They're not waiting for institutions to tell them what's acceptable, what's unacceptable.
Mm.
People are really starting to be moved to, I think, a very individualistic way of thinking about their own version and brand of happiness, which it's not happening en masse for sure, but I think we're
Yeah.
moving into that season. Um, we probably grew up, you and I are around the same age,
Mm-hmm.
where we were given a formula.
Mm-hmm.
You go to these schools, you get this type of job, you get married, you have 2.5 kids, and you get a white
Mm-hmm.
picket fence house, and then eventually move to the suburbs, you retire, the end.
Right. Right.
And you're doing your best to like live this formula because you've been told that if you live out this formula, you will be happy.
Mm-hmm.
And many of us are now realizing there isn't fulfillment, there isn't happiness in that script. And millennials and the kind of the digital natives and Generation Z and those kind of coming next, I think are starting to have permission, giving themselves permission. The institutions aren't giving them permission. The church is not giving them
Mm-hmm.
permission.
Mm-hmm.
Families aren't saying, dear child, you can go out and be non-binary. People are
Right.
saying, I don't want to fill in any of those boxes, other, or I don't want to be in that type of relationship just because my grandparents were in it. I'm going to go define love. I'm going to define what professional success looks like for me. I'm going
Mm-hmm.
to define like people don't feel the need to buy homes. They're the shared economy. So like there are many things that have that suggest that we no longer group think happiness. Like group
Yeah.
think meaning like let's all get together and let's agree on what happiness. And then
Mm-hmm.
we sit around at the table and we keep reinforcing these norms. And today people are kind of like in their own, I think, more than in the past, in their own spaces saying like, no, who am I authentically? What is my authentic, kind of need and version of happiness? And I don't really need anyone else to co-sign on it.
Right.
Um, it's nice to have 1,000 likes on your picture on Instagram, but for the most part, I think more people than not are like, I'm going to go have the experience, whether people like it or not. And
Right.
I think that's a good thing, even if the
Mm-hmm.
movies aren't telling the stories yet.
Right. So here's the question for you. Why do you think, because I mean, we're talking about the depiction of Black poly and Black non-monogamy. Um, Now, with my Belle, is it Black poly? I mean, the character is Black and she's poly and queer. What I am noticing, and I'm just I've been trying to dig and find depictions of like Black poly between all Black partners, right? Whether queer where it's a guy and a Black woman, two Black men, or two Black, you know what I mean, like I do feel that that there's this representation, because we saw this, funny enough, we saw this in when we started to get more depictions of Black queer characters. They tended to have white partners, right? Usually in movies and TV, if you saw a Black, it was to the point where I could just pretty much predict if I saw a Black gay male character, I was like, oh boy, his boyfriend is white. But it was a white guy. And I was like, wow. Okay. So then it became this thing, or even a Black lesbian, her lover was white. And so it became this idea that queerness for Black people had to be tied to whiteness in some way, right? And I'm not saying you can't, as a Black queer person, you can't be in an interracial relationship. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, as far as the depictions, it was it was hard to find two Black lesbians or two Black gay men, or a Black trans woman, and you know what I mean, like it was, you had to really dig for it. I think we're starting to see it now with Pose. I'm so sad it's gone now, but I think now that it's like you said, because we have more creatives, more Black creatives in the game, they're like, no, there's actually Black gay couples. I have a friend of mine, Kirk Moore, he's a writer and producer in Hollywood, and I think they're doing a reboot of the Proud Family, and just quickly, uh, the actor Billy Porter is voicing this Black gay man in the Proud Family reunion, and his husband is a white Jewish man, big white guy, or what? He's not Jewish, but a white guy or whatever. And
Yep.
Kirk was like, I'm so tired of this. He was like, I've been in Hollywood. I'm a black gay man. Kirk is gay. He's openly gay. He was like, what do we have to do to find the representation of the life that I'm living? So he put a challenge out on Twitter a couple of months ago. He was like, if you're a black male gay couple, please post your pictures. Oh my God, Craig, that thing went viral. It was like,
Right.
it was so beautiful to see. It was like wedding pictures, vacation pictures. And it's just like, why don't we see this? I mean, we had Noah's Ark and, you know what I mean? But all to say that now that we're having these representation of black poly people, I'm beginning to see the same thing there, where it's like, if you're a black poly person or a non-monogamous person, your partner is white. And I'm like, why?
Yeah.
You
I
know
don't
what
know
I
if
mean?
there's the kind of the supply demand stuff. I'm not in the movie business, and you know more about it than I do.
Right.
I can imagine people would say, well, what are the stories that will sell, and what are the stories that the mass, Gen Pop will accept and understand and relate to, and how can we like create this formula where like the Cheerios commercial, like everybody sees something in that commercial that like allows them to like want to go buy a box of Cheerios. I'm not smart enough to understand the psychology of like nudging and like and like how do you target and micro target communities and buy. But I will say that the supply side, like those stories are there. The fact that people posted all those pictures, whether or not the film industry like sees a profit or sees like we could do whatever 20 shows and like really make money on this is almost like not dependent. It's not dependent upon, or rather, I should say, the supply. Like it is like happening independent of like people putting those images out there. But I will say that we are, I think, maybe entering into a golden age for Black film. Like watching them and Underground Railroad and like my good friend Saladin Patterson, who's doing the remake of The Wonder Years with Fred Savage. Yeah, absolutely. And so I think there are now Black writers and producers and executive producers and actors and actresses who are now finding they have permission to tell stories that they didn't have permission to tell before, right? Like we have permission to now introduce characters, and now there's a whole Wakanda. It was one of the highest grossing movies, and it's not about the traditional basketball player, kind of savior relationship between kind of like the poor, destitute Black child in the hood who's saved by the way. Like we see these scripts and
all
those
the
formats,
time.
You just take it off the shelf and like rinse, repeat, and we kind of have we know what kind of money we'll make. Now we are seeing an industry that's more comfortable. Well, let's tell a story that we haven't seen before, and let's introduce characters and let's introduce relationships that we haven't seen before. And to your point, and to your rightful, frustration, we don't see enough of it, and we're certainly not seeing all the permutations that we need to reflect the reality. Right. I do sense that we're starting to see more of it. Certainly more than what you and I saw 20, 30, 40 years ago.
That's very true.
But we have a long ways to go.
Yeah. Do you think, but I'm wondering if there's a connection there because, okay, on one hand, I'm saying, okay, we don't have enough depictions of like Black poly couples or Black polycules, but is that tied to the fact that we're in the Black community? That's something they still don't want to talk. Like that's still taboo. I mean, we're still dealing. Yeah, like
Real
queer.
talk.
Yeah.
So I mean, like, all right. So this is like, if we go sit around our kitchen table, we're gonna have real talk, right? So I mean, I do think in our community, we have not even seen. We're just getting to the place where we can see ourselves as like normal, high functioning, professional, kind of human beings in society. We're just now seeing ourselves as a president. We're just now seeing ourselves, like Claire and Bill Huxtable. That was like the first time we'd ever seen like in movies and TV shows, like this functional, healthy Black family. And we haven't really had a Cosby Show since. I mean, we've had Blackish and we have some other ones that are really cool. But by and large, I think there's still a part of us that are trying to play catch up.
Yeah.
I don't know what it's like to be Italian American and be like, another mafia movie. Really? Do we have to see another mafia movie? Can we please show an Italian being the president of the United States? I would imagine.
Wow, that's a good point. I have not seen that in the movie. movies. I don't think we've
So
had an Italian.
you
Yeah,
probably have not. You'd be like, please,
yeah.
John Travolta, can you not play another like bad guy? Um, and so there's probably so I think there are two things going on.
Okay.
One is we haven't had agency around our sexuality, around our imagery, like our storytelling, and I
Hmm.
think we're still trying to catch up and just like in many ways like establish some of like the basics,
Yeah.
right? Like the
Hmm.
basics of
Right.
in a distribution of like these personas show up in society. We've only like focused on like one thin slice,
Hmm.
and I think there's kind of some pent up demand to just see some other broader images that a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah.
But that's not to say that, and therefore we should wait another 30 years before we see all of the other diversity in our community.
Mm.
But I do think that and part of that having not had agency over our faith, over
Hmm.
our bodies, over our sexuality. I mean, all of that stuff has always been kind of fed to us and manipulated and either fetishized or monetized. And so I think people are hesitant
Hmm.
to do things that seem to be risky. And this is stepping out of a norm when, I'm just now being viewed as
Hmm.
normal.
Don't rock the
Um,
boat.
yeah,
Right.
and like, wait a minute now, and all of that is a fallacy, as you and I both know.
Yeah.
That's all kind of fallacious and thinking of it that way.
Hmm.
But we are also too a people who are pretty conservative, despite the way films depict us and the way people imagine Black people to be.
Hmm.
Most of our families are pretty religious, even if you're not, or but we come up out of the church. We kind of come out of a kind of a certain sense of community and communal norms that have
Hmm.
largely defined the African American experience and largely been responsible for our survival.
Hmm.
And so stepping outside of some of those norms sometimes can be really threatening when you have a
Yeah.
conversation with someone about like, well, is that you really think Jesus did that? That's really unnerving to someone to like even have an academic conversation about like who was, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
who might this, Nazarene, Palestinian Jew been,
Hmm.
2,000 years ago, like we don't. So some of the things that we ought to be comfortable having a conversation about, things we ought to feel like we have permission to like explore and create safe space in our community. I think we're still, trying to get there because I
Yeah.
think in many ways being kind of very rigid in our understanding and our definitions of ourselves and our sexualities in many ways is probably how we survived
Yeah.
an environment of kind of chaos.
Hmm.
But you know what? It's time for us to kind of shed some of that, which
Yeah.
is the vestiges of slavery and the vestiges of Jim Crow and all of the trauma that has really been inflicted on our people, so that
Hmm.
we can begin to see ourselves as a much, a diverse and broad and beautiful tapestry and mosaic of people who have very different experiences, different beliefs, different
Hmm.
desires, different ambitions.
Hmm.
We don't all listen to the same music. We don't all like want the same things. We don't all want to live in, in Atlanta. We don't all, and that's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
And to this point on, different types of relationships, Black poly, not everyone's going to want to be in a heteronormative monogamous relationship with 2.5 kids living in the suburbs.
Hmm.
Like that's okay. And
Hmm.
that's going to be fine for some people, but that's not going to make sense for others. And that's not going to be their authentic self. And we
Right.
ought to create space so that we can start to like encourage people to not only pursue that, but if nothing else, make sure you're not doing anything to make space unsafe for someone else who does. And that's
Hmm.
something we need to do in our community is we need to like be able to talk about this and talk about your sexuality, talk about your experiences, talk about your desires, and not be attacked for it.
Right.
And then, sure, when we have the opportunity to tell these stories on Main Street
Hmm.
and on the mainstream, main screen, we ought to be able to go support that and demand that we see those stories because that's part of us.